She walked into a courtroom built inside the Tower of London, and by the time she sat down, the outcome had already been decided by almost everyone except her. 3 days earlier, 4 men had been convicted of sleeping with her, which meant the peers now sitting in judgment weren't there to weigh new evidence. They were there to formally agree with a verdict the machinery of Henry's government already appeared designed to produce. It was the 15th of May, 1536, and her own uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided as Lord High Steward, not as her defender, but as the official overseeing a trial whose political direction was already unmistakable. And that's really the question worth asking, because this was never simply about whether Anne Boleyn was guilty. It's about who turned rumour and suspicion into a death sentence, and whether Henry VIII actually believed the case against his own wife, or just needed it to be true. This is a cold case in every sense that matters. The indictments survive, the ambassador's letters survive, and the machinery of the trial survives. But no complete record of the evidence actually presented in that courtroom does, and that gap between accusation and evidence is exactly where this investigation begins. Anne Boleyn had spent nearly a decade fighting her way to the English throne, and by 1533 she had won, becoming queen after Henry rejected papal authority and transformed England's relationship with Rome in order to secure their marriage. She gave him a daughter, Elizabeth, but the son he needed to secure his dynasty never came, and by January of 1536, that failure had turned dangerous. Catherine of Aragon died that same month, and while her death didn't automatically endanger Anne, it simplified Henry's position considerably. It removed the possibility that any reconciliation with Emperor Charles V might somehow involve restoring Catherine. And it meant that if Henry abandoned Anne now, there was no living first wife left to complicate whatever came next. Within weeks, Anne miscarried what was reportedly a male child, and whatever affection Henry still had for her began to visibly cool. He was already paying attention to one of her own ladies-in-waiting, a quiet young woman named Jane Seymour, and Anne, never a woman who hid her feelings well, had spent years making enemies at a court where enemies remembered everything. By the spring of 1536, she wasn't just a queen who had failed to produce an heir. She was a queen whose enemies no longer feared defending themselves against her, and whose allies could no longer be certain the king would protect them. The case against her didn't begin with an affair, it began with a conversation. According to an account Anne later gave to her jailer in the Tower, William Kingston, she had argued with Henry Norris, one of the king's closest attendants, on the 29th of April, about why he still hadn't married her cousin Madge Shelton, and in the heat of it she accused him of waiting around for her, waiting for dead men's shoes, meaning he was waiting for Henry to die so he could have Anne himself. That kind of comment wasn't just careless, because words that appeared to anticipate the king's death could be used as evidence of treason, especially once combined with accusations of adultery and conspiracy. Anne seemed to realize how badly that had landed, because she pushed Norris to publicly swear she was an honorable woman, not necessarily because the exchange had revealed anything real, but because she understood exactly how dangerously her own words could be interpreted. Whether it was flirtation, an argument, or something else entirely, we'll probably never know. But it handed whoever was watching exactly the kind of material that could be reshaped into something far darker. And someone was watching. The very next day, a court musician named Mark Smeaton was quietly detained and questioned, and by the end of that interrogation, he had confessed to sleeping with the Queen. He was the only one of the accused men who ever confessed, and he was also the most socially vulnerable, a commoner surrounded by gentlemen, which made him far easier to pressure than a knight or a nobleman. Nobody knows exactly what happened in that room, and diplomatic reports at the time raised the possibility of torture, but no surviving record proves how his confession was actually obtained, only that once it existed, everything moved very fast. On May Day itself, Henry personally questioned Norris at the joust and reportedly offered him mercy if he told the truth, but Norris refused to confess, and by the following day he, George Boleyn and Anne herself were all prisoners in the Tower. Anne had been taken from Greenwich Palace and rowed down the Thames on the 2nd of May, and over the following 3 days 2 more men joined the list, Francis Weston and William Brereton. until 5 men stood accused of sleeping with the Queen of England, one of them her own brother. Look closely at who was actually chosen, and a pattern starts to emerge that feels less like a discovered conspiracy and more like a list being assembled. Norris was tied to Anne's dangerous remark, Weston to ordinary court flirtation. Brereton was a politically useful royal servant with considerable influence across Wales and the Welsh Marches. And George Boleyn was the most damaging accusation of all, because charging Anne with incest alongside adultery didn't just end a marriage, it destroyed the entire Boleyn family's credibility in a single stroke. It's worth being honest about Brereton specifically, because he wasn't a nobleman, and Cromwell may well have wanted him gone for reasons that had nothing to do with Anne at all. That's not a universally accepted claim. It's a plausible motive layered on top of the accusation, and the documentary should treat it as exactly that. Around the same time, accusations and reports began surfacing from inside Anne's own household, most notably from Elizabeth Brown, the Countess of Worcester, who reportedly claimed during an unrelated family argument that the Queen's own conduct was far worse than anything she herself was being accused of. Other women in Anne's circle were named too, though how much of what they said was genuine knowledge, and how much was rumour hardening into fact as it passed from mouth to mouth, is impossible to fully untangle now. What matters is that by the 12th of May, Norris, Weston, Brereton and Smeaton had all been tried and convicted, Smeaton maintaining his confession, while the other 3 denied every charge against them. Unlike the others, Smeaton reportedly never retracted that confession, not even at the scaffold, which is genuinely the strongest single thing anyone can point to in the prosecution's favour. Anne would be tried 3 days later for adultery with men a court had already ruled guilty of committing adultery with her, which meant her own trial had effectively been decided before she ever walked into the room. Before dismissing the prosecution's case entirely, it deserves a fair hearing, because a few real fragments sit underneath all of this. Smeaton confessed, and as far as we know, he never took it back. Anne's exchange with Norris was undeniably dangerous, whatever she actually meant by it, and reports of improper behaviour circulated from inside her own household. Because the detailed trial testimony hasn't survived, historians like G.W. Bernard caution that the absence of surviving proof isn't the same as proof that every allegation was invented. So the real question becomes whether these fragments add up to a credible case, or whether they're ambiguous pieces forced into a story the government had already decided to tell. Here is where we can finally test that case against what actually survives, and it's the closest thing this cold case has to a forensic test of the prosecution's story. The indictments accused Anne of sleeping with these men at named royal residences on specific days, going back years, and when historians laid those dates against what's actually known about Anne's movements, her pregnancies and her confinements, several of the alleged encounters became very hard to explain. By Ives's calculation, roughly 3/4 of the specific allegations could be seriously challenged on exactly these grounds. G.W. Bernard offers a different explanation. He argues that Tudor law required prosecutors to attach specific dates and places to general accusations, so officials may simply have been forcing vague rumours into the legally usable shape the court demanded, using what he calls informed guesswork rather than outright invention. But even taking that explanation seriously, it doesn't rescue the indictments as a reliable record of anything. Whether through fabrication or guesswork, what survives isn't a diary of documented affairs, it's a set of legal accusations built around a conclusion the prosecution was already working towards. That impression only deepens when you look at the wording itself, because the indictments repeatedly use phrases like divers days before and since, language broad enough to survive almost any individual date being challenged. No confession from the other 4 men survives. No incriminating letter survives. No reliable eyewitness account of an actual encounter survives. And no surviving servant's testimony explains how repeated affairs could have gone undetected inside a household with almost no real privacy. For a queen who was, by the nature of her position, almost never truly alone, that silence is louder than it should be. So if the evidence doesn't hold up as a genuine record, who actually built this? Historians roughly converge on 3 explanations, and they're not entirely competing, because more than one of them could be true at once. The first, argued most forcefully by Eric Ives, places Thomas Cromwell at the center of it all. Cromwell ran the government machinery that turned rumour into formal treason charges, and by 1536, he and Anne had genuine political disagreements over how to spend the wealth seized from dissolved monasteries, over foreign policy, over who held real influence around the king. In Ives's reading, Cromwell came to see Anne as a threat to his own position and engineered a case efficient enough to remove her and several of her allies in one coordinated strike. A second explanation, associated with historian Greg Walker, suggests nothing this organized was planned from the very beginning. Anne's careless words with Norris, gossip from inside her household, and then Smeaton's confession created an escalating crisis that Henry came to genuinely believe, and only once that belief had formed did Cromwell step in and turn it into a formal prosecution. Ives himself acknowledged that gossip played a real role, though he argued it doesn't fully explain why investigators turned specifically to Smeaton immediately after the Norris incident, which is a fair objection this investigation can't fully resolve either way. The third view keeps Henry himself at the center, and it gets harder to escape the closer you look at the timeline. Cromwell may have built the machinery, and gossip may have supplied the raw material, but only Henry could turn Anne's removal into actual state policy, and nothing of this scale happens inside a Tudor court without the king's direct approval. The investigation proceeded with Henry's knowledge and authority, and he accepted proceedings that executed his own wife and members of his own household on evidence that doesn't survive real scrutiny. Bernard himself argues Henry may have genuinely believed the accusations, that evidence now lost to us may once have existed, and that we shouldn't claim more certainty than the surviving record actually allows, which is a fair caution to hold on to. But even taking that caution seriously, an implausible pattern of dates, a single confession that was never retracted, and a result that happened to give Henry exactly what he wanted, all landing within the same 3 weeks, is a great deal of coincidence to accept at face value. Maybe the truest answer isn't Cromwell alone, Henry alone, or gossip spiraling out of control, but some combination of all 3, moving through a machine built to serve whatever the king ultimately wanted. Peers who knew the consequences of resisting a prosecution backed by the king. Attendants inside the tower who reported Anne's private words back to Cromwell's officials, because that was safer than staying silent. Nobody had to invent a conspiracy out of nothing. They only had to recognize what the king wanted and give it to him. On the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn was executed inside the walls of the Tower of London, not by the usual English axe, but by a swordsman commissioned from Calais, a small, almost considerate mercy in a process that had shown her none. She knelt before a small official crowd drawn from the court and the tower. The world that had watched her rise now gathered to witness her removal. The following day, Henry and Jane Seymour were formally betrothed. 10 days after that, on the 30th of May, they were married. For more forgotten cases, famous mysteries, and dark history, consider subscribing. Until next time.